Listen to Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë, Level A1, Oxford Reading University. Part 2. You will find Part 1 here.
Everyone looked at him in surprise. Jane couldn't believe it. How could this be? "My sister lives at Thornfield Hall," Mr. Mason went on. Jane just stood there and looked hard at Mr. Rochester's pale face. In the end, he spoke. "It's true. I married Mason's sister, Bertha, 15 years ago. But soon after the wedding, she lost her mind. She became crazy and dangerous. She tried to kill me. Not long ago, she attacked her brother. She lives at Thornfield and has a nurse that looks after her. Her name is Grace Poole." Later, Mr. Rochester took Jane to the attic where the mad woman lived. It was she who set Mr. Rochester's bed on fire and attacked Mr. Mason, Jane realized. She was the woman who destroyed my veil. Even though she is mad, she is still Mr. Rochester's wife. I cannot marry him. So Jane became lonely and unhappy again. One morning, without a word to anyone, she left Thornfield Hall. Jane used all her money to pay for the journey. She traveled far from Thornfield. She was tired and hungry. One night, she had to sleep on the street in the rain. She sat down outside the door of a house. She was too tired to move. The owner of the house was a priest named St. John. The young man felt sorry for Jane and took her in. His sisters, Mary and Diana, took care of her. They offered to let her stay with them until she found a job. With St. John's help, Jane began working as a teacher in the village school. Soon, she moved out of his house. St. John often visited her. Jane liked her quiet life in the village, but she never stopped loving Mr. Rochester, and thinking about him made her very sad. One night, St. John came to see Jane. They sat together by the fire. The man was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. "Jane, I know the story of your life. I know about your parents, Mrs. Reed, and your time at Lowood. I also know about Mr. Rochester and his wife. He is a terrible man." "No, he isn't terrible," Jane cried. She was still in love with him. "Do you know how he is? Tell me." "No," St. John replied, "but I can tell you something about your uncle, Mr. John Eyre. He died recently and left all his money to you."
Do you want more English audiobooks with translations and transcriptions? In the Eyre app, you can check the translation of new words, add them to your list, and practice them later by playing word games. See for yourself at appeyre.com.
"Now you are rich, Jane." Jane just sat there and looked at him in surprise. "But how do you know all this?" she asked after a while. "I know this because Mr. John Eyre is my mother's brother," St. John replied. "He is my uncle." "Which makes us cousins," Jane finished and smiled. "This means that we can share his money between the four of us. We can live happily together." Jane felt happy to have money after being poor for so long. But more than that, she was happy to finally have a family. She was not alone anymore. Soon, St. John decided to go to India as a missionary. He asked Jane out for a walk in the garden. When they were alone, he said, "Jane, I want you to come to India with me." "But I will be of very little help to you," Jane started. "I don't want you to be my helper. I want you to be my wife," St. John said. Jane couldn't believe it. She just looked at him in surprise for a very long time. Then she said quietly, "If I go with you, we can work together, but I cannot be your wife." "No, Jane, you must be my wife," he said. "It's the only right thing to do." Jane turned away from him to hide her crying face. She was thinking about Mr. Rochester. He always spoke kindly to her, and St. John was so serious and cold. He was a good man, but he didn't love Jane. And she knew that she could never love him. "I'm leaving for 2 weeks," he went on. "When I return, I want your answer, Jane." That night, Jane lay in bed without sleep. She was thinking about St. John. She didn't know what she should do. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice. It was Mr. Rochester. "Jane!" he called. "Jane!" Am I dreaming? Jane thought. But it didn't matter to her. She felt that Mr. Rochester needed her. I must go to him at once, she decided. The next morning, Jane traveled back to Thornfield. When she saw her dear old home, she couldn't believe her eyes. Then she started crying. The house was burned to the ground. Jane went to the village to find out what happened. A man at the local hotel told her, "Last fall, Mr. Rochester's wife started a fire in the house. Nobody ever saw her, but people said that she was mad." "What happened to Mr. Rochester, Adele, and the servants?" Jane asked. She was very scared. "Adele was away at school," the man replied. "Mr. Rochester got all the servants out of the house and returned to save his wife. People saw her standing on the roof. Mr. Rochester wanted to help her, but she didn't let him. Then she fell from the roof and died. Mr. Rochester was badly hurt. When he ran out of the house, he had burns all over his body. Also, he became blind." "Where is he now?" Jane cried. "He moved to a little house not far from here," the man said. Jane decided to go there at once. She was very scared, but also she was happy that Mr. Rochester was alive. When she arrived, she asked a servant, Mary, to show her into Mr. Rochester's room. She entered, sat down next to him, and took his hands into hers. "Mary, is that you?" he asked her. "Would you like some water, sir?" Jane said. He recognized her voice at once. "Jane! Oh, dear Jane! Why did you leave?" he cried. "You know why, Mr. Rochester," she replied. "But all has changed. I am rich now, and I am going to stay with you." Then she told him everything. "But if you are a rich woman, then you don't need me anymore," Mr. Rochester said sadly. "I am blind now, and I can't do anything by myself. You are still young. You can marry your cousin and live a happy life. Will you really stay?" "Yes," she said with a smile. "I like my cousin, and he even asked me to marry him, but I don't love him." Mr. Rochester smiled, although he couldn't see her. After some time, he said quietly, "Jane, may I ask you again? Will you be my wife?" "Yes," she said softly. She felt happier than ever before. 3 days later, they got married. Soon after that, Adele returned from school to live with them. Everyone was very happy. 2 years later, Mr. Rochester's eyes began to see again, and he saw their baby for the first time. The baby was beautiful and had his eyes, big, black, and shiny. Life hasn't been easy for both of us, Jane thought. But now we are together. At last, we are happy.
Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more free audiobooks. And now, listen to another English story.